Congratulations, Drew, on this beautiful film, and to you and Megan. I wanted to start by talking about something that people perhaps noticed in the credits or may already know, but is quite unusual, actually, for a film like this, that you're the lone camera operator in the field. And this puts you in a parallel relationship with that of the field researchers, as I saw it, that you yourself are a researcher, albeit with a camera, and that what the film did for me, at least, is it brought me on this journey of discovery alongside the scientists. But so I wondered if you could talk a bit about your own role as a field researcher with a camera, and the kind of intimacy that endears or engenders with your subjects. So in other words, a bit about the collaborative process.
Yeah, this film was a completely different experience for me as a filmmaker, because there's the one responsibility of just doing someone's story justice, just another human being, and there's enormous weight to do that well. But on top of that, there's scientists, and their careers are at stake, based on how I portray them, how I portray their work. And so as a sort of researcher in parallel with them, my job is not only to witness, like, what is it to be in the field, what is it to be in these very stressful, remote places, but also kind of their responsibility as ambassadors to their work as being part of this film. And it's complicated, and I learned so much in making this film. Like, I don't think you should make a film unless there's a question you need to answer, and the only way you can answer is by making the film, right? And one of the many questions that were answered for me is how they view themselves and how they view their responsibilities as scientists. Michelle and I, the researcher in Alaska, she and I had many discussions about sort of the role of the scientist and the role of the work versus their own image. And she had huge beef with the history of science in terms of being about the intrepid scientist who, like, goes off to this place and discovers this amazing thing, and they go into the history books and their legacy is sealed up, and they go, and she's like, it should be about the knowledge. It should be about the stories that we come back with, and less about the scientists. And that was a complicated thing to navigate, because I'm making a film about her and her work, and of course she's featured in it, and her personal life and all of that. So it was kind of remarkable and humbling to spend all this time with her, and for me to be rooting for her and just hoping that it goes well, and hoping that the work comes to fruition and she gets, some kind of, I wasn't expecting a breakthrough in the field, but I was at least expecting progress, that by the end of it there would be something new that she'd be able to understand that would lead to the next step. But also negotiating this idea of trying to make a film about these two researchers while not making it about how intrepid and incredible it is to be a discoverer of new things, to make it about the work and the story about the work as much as it was about the people, to respect the humility that they both demanded.
Well, that calls to mind also the riskiness of the endeavor, right? That everything's uncertain, and the film also was in the balance. At several moments, I thought, when the engine quit working, I thought, oh, what's going to happen with this segment of the film? But again, that nothing is assured, and I think that was a pleasurable experience, actually, to not know where the research would go, and to be in this place of discovery, actually. And so the film is less about, certainly it's about the whales, but it's also so much about certainly the researchers, but also about us, which becomes clear at the end. But I wanted to talk, or have you speak a bit about the artistry of the film, because on the one hand, a lot of it is certainly about the science and this process of discovery, and there's a lot of exposition and really wonderful efforts made to communicate the science to us in these artful ways. I thought that was quite beautiful. But there are all these images, too, that are just so poetic. For example, even like this hand holding a hydrophone and lowering it into the water, or these moments of wonder, the jellyfish, for example, or the bog.
My favorite image of the whole film.
Yeah. But so I wondered how that works for you when you're in the field, given that this is literally your vision, which is such a joy to see, that you're really looking, you're engaging with the subject when you shoot, not only for information, but also for cinema. So I wonder how you balance that with the aims of the film to convey also information.
Yeah, I've been the cinematographer on fiction and nonfiction works for other directors also, and I think what's unique, one way to think about nonfiction or documentary films is that you have to relinquish control over certain things, in my opinion. And on the one hand, it's my eye and my expression and my voice, and certainly a part of it, but in some ways my job is to figure out how to express Michelle and Ellen's voice and their eyes and how they see things, and it eventually comes about kind of, so when, to me, casting is about, like for this film, casting was about like, I want great scientists, like that's number one, people who are doing great work and doing it diligently, and two, it was people who left home for a long period of time in order to pursue their work. But three, it's really about people who you get along with and become friends with. Like what you're asking of them is tremendous. But that sort of relatability of that's how you get on the same wavelength. For me, that's how I can sort of see with their eyes. I'm spending so much time with them at home and in the field and having conversations about like, what do you see? Like, what do you love? And not in that kind of, I'm not having a Q&A with her being like, what do you love, Michelle? But it's just hanging out with them and hearing what calls her attention, hearing what turns her senses on. And it just kind of starts happening. You start taking on their eyes and their way of seeing the world, and it just starts happening. I mean, Michelle told me about, that jellyfish. She told me about, it's a lion's mane jellyfish. The head of it is as big as this table, actually, and the tentacles are, it would reach from one end of the room to the other. They're so cool. And she told me about it, and she was just, Michelle's in love with everything. Like, she sees everything that she sees, she's curious about and wants to know more about, and it's contagious. I'm a curious person too, so it wasn't that hard. But yeah, I think it comes naturally with the kind of immersion that you get with this kind of filmmaking. You start to absorb how they see the world and what they fall in love with, and then that's where my role takes over of like translating it cinematically.
Could you talk a bit about the other kinds of research that went into the film, whether it was looking at documentaries or reading journals, for example, or scientific or academic studies about whales? What was the kind of range of research that you did before or during production or post-production? Was there much of that, or was it mostly based on the field work that you did with the scientists?
No, the fieldwork came last. Like I just read a lot of science. Like I read a lot of like journals and popular articles and books ranging from like really academic-y kind of textbook stuff to actually popular books. And I have recommendations for anybody who's curious. But I just fell in love with it, and it painted this portrait that felt of another consciousness that felt more interesting than any science fiction I'd ever read or seen before. And I was just really captivated by it, and I spent about probably like eight months to a year just reading the science. And then I realized, oh my God, if I'm having this much of an emotional reaction from just reading the papers, surely the people who are out on boats, it must be profound for them. And then I sort of was thinking about like, God, you must be at sea for a long time, and these places aren't convenient most of the time. So I started hanging out at whale conferences, and it's really fun because, think about like any kind of whale or dolphin that you're into, and there's like 7 talks about it, about the anatomy, about the morphology, about the cognition, about anything we know, and then you get to have beers with them afterward, and they're so like excited to talk to somebody who's not just a scientist, and they're so generous, and they invited me out on their boats, and I went to these incredible places, and I got to see, one thing that was really clear from their point of view was that they hadn't really interacted with a filmmaker who was genuinely interested in their research. Whales are the most charming megafauna on the planet, arguably, and elephants are great too, but arguably. And most filmmakers approach them and they want to use their permit to be able to film whales and kind of film over their shoulders and bypass this amazing work that's happening, because it's really hard work. This was really hard work to try and translate research that's on the actual cutting edge, and working with them we talked about collaborating with them. They helped write all the voiceover. I wanted them to be the voices of the narration. I love Cate Blanchett, her voice is amazing, but it was important to have them be the narrators, for them to own it. They're the experts and you see it on screen, so when you hear their voices you trust it and you know that it's real. So it was a collaboration in that way, which is really difficult because you're balancing poetry and cinema with their parameters as scientists, which are real. I can say things that they can't say, and they're junior scientists as well, so they have a lot at stake. So it was a really unique set of parameters to make work that I hadn't come across before. Yeah.
The structure of the film is also quite clever. We don't go beneath the surface until the very end, once we have these certain revelations. And I was really impressed by the way you linked the sound from the surface to beneath the depth. And for me, that was a real kind of metaphor for the whole lens of the film, that we're thinking about something that we can't fully see or fully understand or grasp. And of course, the title Fathom is so evocative in to these ends. But I noticed a cautiousness within the film. It has these speculative moments, but it's also really careful about making claims. At the end, there's this leap, and it's made by Dr. Garland, I think,
yeah.
who says, who links this to consciousness and global communication, and that's in the text as well. But you were very careful about that. So could you talk about how you balanced speculation? And I noticed some kind of science fiction kind of references in terms of the images. And that's there, but you were very careful about that. So could you talk a bit about how you engaged with the science and the speculative in the film?
Yeah, it's when it became, to me, the lifeblood of this film is a traditional verite film. You're witnessing two people's lives in this kind of real time unfolding in chapters. And at the end of the day, the film had to be in service to their stories and their voices and their work. And I was talking with one of their colleagues about how to represent culture or how to talk about it, and he said, just go with it, man. Just say whatever you need to say. You're the artist. You get to say whatever you want to say. I was like, yeah, but it's their voices, and they have to edit this writing, and they have to read it in the end of the day. So it has to be their voice. So what's interesting is the film is restrained by basically what you can say as a scientist, which I think is really valid for an audience to hear. There's poetry in it, but you're hearing exactly what a scientist is comfortable saying. It's really specific, and we tortured over that. And so, there's a lot of, I think there's other films where they're not necessarily saying they're the voice of the scientist, and they can take a lot of poetic liberties. But this is the real deal. What you heard and saw in this film is actually what is representative of how they felt and how they could express their ideas. So, yeah. It's a balancing act between poetry and the actual science, and it was quite an exercise.
In the edit, were there things that you retracted because of that carefulness around representing science, or?
Yeah,
and you don't have to share if you don't wish, but I'm just wondering how.
I'll give you an example. This is there's a long history of why this is and why they need to be so cautious about how they talk about things. I can talk to anybody who wants to hear about John Lilly and psychedelics, giving LSD to dolphins, and how that changed science for 2 generations after that. But that's basically the shadow that they're in. So you have to be so careful to not be I love whales, or science is so cautious that to use the word consciousness is actually really controversial, which is insane to me. I don't know, I have a dog. She's conscious. I don't think she's an automaton, I don't think she's a balloon of predictable reactions to things. She's totally conscious and sentient, and so why wouldn't they be? But this is really about the culture of science and where it's at, and it's fascinating. There are limits to how you can talk about things without losing legitimacy as a scientist. So there's one thing where the whoop call, the hello I am. At one point I proposed to Michelle using the metaphor of like it's an acoustic face, in the sense that you can't really control what your face looks like. It is genetics, you're born with it, it's a signature of who you are, but also you can affect, it can have information about how you're feeling as well, right? So you can affect it, and it can have all this other kind of information into it. And she was really cautious about that. And she said, no, acoustic fingerprint. And I was like, well, that's not right either, because you can't affect your fingerprint. And it's not about, she was limited by what's like empirically known, like what's been like shown and suggested very strongly. So it's an interesting give and take as the artist and the filmmaker.
And yet she does say it's akin to hello, I am, which is another kind of leap as well about consciousness and self-awareness. And I found that really revelatory, because I know nothing about whales, but as an anthropologist, I think a lot about culture, so this was really revealing and exciting.
Well, a lot of the reason why these two researchers are exceptional in the world is because they spend so much time, they spend so much of their life with whales in a world that they could not survive in. I mean, I always, when we would talk about this film when we were developing it, we talked about they're like two astronauts that zip off to another world to study a consciousness that they almost never see, but they can hear. And that's, to me, that's actually, that is what they're doing. And so by being there, you intuit so much. By seeing the whales, by experiencing them, you intuit a lot. And guess what? That experiment that Michelle and Ellen have come up with, that those studies come from their gut. But they have to translate it into scientific language, and you don't talk about your gut in scientific language. So you test it. So it's this balancing act between, again, like they also had to balance like being able to speak to their intuition without compromising their legitimacy as scientists. There's a lot of pressure. Science is portrayed as an institution of answers, as we all have really gotten up close look in the last 2 years. And it's not. It's an institution of questions. It's not, it's an ever-evolving series of questions, and whatever, Neil deGrasse Tyson put it really well, like it's not about finding the next answer, it's about figuring out what's the question I didn't know to ask before. And that's truly what it is. Whatever they figured out in this film in 10 years will evolve and change, and maybe contradict what they think now in some ways, or expand upon it. By the way, the latest news is that Ecuador, the whales in Ecuador are singing the songs in French Polynesia. This is like fresh off the press, like a week ago. Not published.
Breaking news.
Breaking news, but this is like unofficial, not published, and a lot of other really cool things. Michelle is doing ongoing work with how humpbacks are communicating. But it's continuing to evolve.
Could I ask you a hard question? Which is, how do you see cinema contributing then, not only to our understanding of science, as in what it can convey, what it can teach us, but also what it does? Because I see that's really what your film reflects, that it shows us that it's a creative endeavor, it's a risky endeavor, and in that way it's very much akin to cinema, although you could say the stakes might be a bit different, and yet maybe not. So I'm wondering how you think about the relationship between cinema and science.
Yeah, this film, okay, words like cognition, culture, intelligence, communication, language, like up until really recently, and for a lot of people still, those terms define what it is to be a human being, what made us different from everything else. And what captivated me about the stories that they're capturing through their data was that it subverts all those ideas. Rather than it being exclusive to what it is to be a human being, it's actually what connects us to so many other things. And I think that the relationship between the arts and science, once upon a time, like they were interfolded with each other. Like it wasn't so exclusive. Like philosophy informed science and science informed philosophy, and it still does to a degree, but it's so fenced in because of a lot of cultural reasons. So I think it's really important for long form art, stuff that isn't just reporting on things, but actually taking time to expand ideas and bring it to audiences in a different way, like combining the arts, responsible arts, and science is, I think it's, I mean, in this day and age, I think it's absolutely critical for the health of the institution of science, for its transparency, for people to understand what's going on, because the danger is that it becomes such an exclusive club that, you know, there's a famous painting it's set in Rome. It portrays the fall of Rome, and it's these like Roman nobility, these like, and they're being attacked by barbarians, and there's a burn pile of books in front of them that the barbarians are throwing into the fire. And if you look closely, it's scientific, it's mathematical equation, it's science. They're burning the books, and it has this amazing. I mean, it's the tale of like kind of, you know, the danger of if you really keep people out and don't communicate and make it understandable, there's a danger. It's kind of irrelevant. What's the point of it anyway if you can't relate to people?
I think that's it. We'll be, unless, it seems like we'll be moving out into this outer area for drinks, so if you'd like to ask questions directly of the filmmaker, he will be here, as will the producer, and
I want to say one
yes.
quick thing. Dennis Mendez, the assistant editor on the film, is in the house, who was invaluable in making this film. Thank you for applauding him. It's an open bar for a little bit. Y'all should join. I'd love to talk with all of you. And thank you, Stephanie, for moderating. It really meant a lot.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Drew, and Neuehouse and Science Sandbox.
Cancer food.